Yep.
All right, perfect. Okay. Yeah, so thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. And already from the brief presentations you all gave, I can see you're doing really exciting things. And I'm really looking forward to talking about my project with you. Anya, how long should I plan on speaking? Roughly.
45 minutes
Okay.
to an hour is fine.
Okay, sounds good. All right, I'll try to keep it within that time, and I definitely want to make sure I leave enough time for Q&A at the end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk mainly about the project that Anya mentioned, which is really about water access in slum areas in Mumbai, India. I'm going to touch very briefly on some other projects, I mean, if we have time, and then really want to open up for any Q&A or feedback that any of you might have. So just to kind of give you a preview and from your sort of intro, from the little bit of your meeting that I caught, I'm sure I'm not telling you anything new, but essentially our project is motivated by this question of what interventions can be successful in producing formalization. So let me tell you what we mean by formalization. So essentially, if you look on one side of the slide, um, one way that citizens access many public services, from sanitation to electricity, and in this case, I'm going to be talking about water, is by being on the grid, right? And so they are accessing water through a state provided, in this case, a municipally provided water connection. So it's provided by the government. There's a legal framework for access. Typically, such provision is subsidized, it's regulated, it's often, not always, more reliable. It's a source of revenue for the government, which is important because, obviously this not only is good for the government in terms of revenue that it can use for other productive things, but it also sort of strengthens the fiscal contract between citizens and the government. So, citizens have an incentive, for example, to hold governments accountable. Governments have an incentive to recognize citizens for other services, and so on, right? But as you all, I'm sure, are aware, in many cases, citizens, especially the poorer, more marginalized citizens, are not able to be on the grid, and they remain off the grid, and they access services through a range of other means. Oftentimes this is illegal, and that's not said with any judgment, but it is outside the legal framework. It's through private providers. It's often expensive. If it's not expensive, it's often of low quality. It's not regular. And really, this fiscal contract between the citizen and the state is not there. So our project is sort of motivated by this question of what can be done to help citizens get on the grid, and typically what forms of citizen empowerment, because we're really looking to empower citizens to initiate this process, what kind of citizen empowerment could work, if any. Okay, so that's kind of the motivation for our project. Are my slides large enough, or should I make this a little bit short? Should I do the slideshow option? Maybe I'll try the slideshow
Um,
option just so that it's a little bit, so you can see it a little bit better. All right. Just a little bit of background. So we did a couple of months of preliminary field work to just try to identify, to what extent is this a problem? What is the sort of status quo if people don't have a municipal water connection? And what we found, obviously, is that households who don't have access to a municipal water connection are accessing water through other sources. But those other sources typically present one or more of the following challenges. They're either higher cost than the municipal option, they're poorer quality and more contaminated. They take significant time and effort to actually access. And they're often irregular. You can't really predict when you're going to be able to get access to these other sources of water. So I'll just give you a few examples of things that I noticed through this preliminary field work. So this is a picture of one of the residents of one of these informal settlements or slums in Mumbai, India, who's accessing water through a bore well. right? So basically, he's pumping groundwater up to the surface, and the water is of poor quality. It's not suitable for drinking. Actually, most people we talked to knew this already, and they were not using it for drinking, but they were using it for washing dishes or washing clothes, and of course that can be a source of contamination as well. And not only is this, potentially detrimental for, people consuming this water, but it also has environmental costs. As many of you might know, it contributes to groundwater depletion, which is a real problem in many places, but especially in India. Another way, and this is actually a common way that citizens these residents who don't have access to a municipal water connection get water, is through private tankers. So these tankers, basically, they get their water from the municipal water source, and they will go to these settlements. Depending on how big the settlement is, sometimes they'll go, 2 or 3 times a week. Sometimes it's just once a week. Sometimes it's just once in 2 weeks, depending on what's worth their while. And this water is of decent quality, and basically people will line up, as you see in this picture, they'll line up and fill, their own vessels with the tanker water that they'll then use. And as those of you familiar with the kind of wash fields know that this storage could potentially pose problems for contamination, even though the water itself is pure at the source. And oftentimes residents are paying a pretty big premium for this water. It costs, sometimes 100 times more than what it would cost to get that same water through a municipal water connection. There's also a political dimension to this, in the sense that these tankers are often owned by individuals who are in cahoots with sort of the local politicians and the local officials. And they're actually locally known as the water mafia or the tanker mafia. And they often sometimes will physically threaten residents who are seeking to get water through other means. And we encountered this in our study too. If they try to do this, right? They'll really try to kind of physically threaten them, because that's a source of, they're losing business essentially. So obviously there's cost to this method as well, although it's one of the cleaner sources of water. Just a last example. So this is a picture I took of a pipe that is connected to the municipal water supply that is essentially siphoning off water from the municipal water supply illegally to different households. And so this is a relatively inexpensive way, it's a free way to get water once the pipe is established, but of course it has real costs. As you can see, this pipe is running through a sewer, so the risk of contamination runs high. And you can see too that the pipe is really of not good quality, right? It's a really pretty bad quality pipe. And I asked about this because I noticed, in my, talking to many of the people, that they're actually willing to pay a lot for water. And so I was just wondering why they, didn't want to invest in a better quality pipe. And the reason is that this way of getting water is illegal. And so there will be periodic audits and visits by municipal officials who will come and try to, cut these pipes, and then the residents have to then pay to reestablish a new pipe. So it's really not in their interest to spend a lot of money to establish a good quality pipe. So, motivated by these concerns, what we try to do, and this has been a long-running research project, one part of it is still ongoing. What we sought to do is we secured funding from the UK Department for International Development, formerly known as DFID, and we were able to use this funding to partner with 2 local organizations in Mumbai to design and implement 2 large-scale interventions, essentially aimed at helping slum dwellers in Mumbai get on the grid, okay? And so I'll say more about these interventions, but we're essentially assessing 2 interventions. One is bureaucratic assistance, providing citizens with bureaucratic assistance. The second is helping them apply political pressure. But both of these we consider to be citizen empowerment interventions. They're really working by empowering citizens. And so what we seek to do is, just like a clinical trial or similar to one, we are trying to rigorously assess the effectiveness of these interventions to inform future policy and action in terms of what actually helps citizens get on the grid, what actually helps formalization, and then also to study downstream consequences of formalization. This is the part that we haven't quite got to yet. But downstream consequences for health, for well-being, for political engagement, and so on. Okay. So a little bit about the context, just to help kind of give.
Hey, what's up, Xander? What? That's why I asked that question earlier.
Drew, if you could mute yourself. I think you went off mute. Sorry about that.
Okay, no worries. I didn't know if there was a question for me or not, but so just to give you a little bit of context about the study and the setting. So this takes place in Mumbai, which is the commercial capital of India. There's more than 20 million people, and the entity that's responsible for providing water connections is the municipal corporation in the city. And this is actually a pretty wealthy organization. It has a large annual budget. It has over 100,000 employees, and it gets a decent amount of revenue from taxes and fees. So it's an organization that has a pretty good capacity to provide water connections. We are focused on slums in the city. And even within slums, there's a pretty big variation in Mumbai. Many of you might know this. That some slums are really they're really quite well served. They have access to all of the amenities that are sort of basic that you think of, that from sanitation to drinking water to toilets. A lot of them have paved roads. They have well constructed houses, and some of them are really kind of on the other end of the spectrum where they pretty much lack access to any services. The slums, particularly in Mumbai, have a history of internal migration. So a big percentage of the population are people who've come from outside the city, who come to the city to find work and then just can't find an affordable place to live. And so they end up living in these informal settlements. The city has had an interesting relationship with slums. At some point, they realized that they couldn't really ignore that these slums existed or couldn't kind of wish them away. So they started gradually legalizing slums. So in 95, they said that all slums prior to that date were legal. Then in 2000, they made another revision saying that slums established before 2000 were legal. But slums established after 2000, as of now, are considered illegal. And legality matters because that is often a big determinant of whether slums are able to get access to basic services, including water. And so many of our slums that we chose for our study tend to be illegal slums because they don't have access to water. That said, we are, something that happened that was kind of advantageous for our study was that in 2014, the High Court in the city passed a ruling that was actually in response to a petition filed by one of our partners, one of our local partners in Mumbai, that basically petitioned that water is a human right, and so regardless of whether someone is living in the city legally or illegally, or if a slum is legal or illegal, they have the right to water. And the court ruled in the petitioner's favor, saying that the state cannot deny water supply to any slums, regardless of whether they're legal or illegal. So even though we're working in a legal slum, they have very recently become eligible. And at least as of when the study started, which was around 2017, it was pretty recent. But as usual in many developing country settings, there's the gap between sort of what's on the books and what actually happens. And so there were a lot of, and particularly the city government does not, and I can talk about this in Q&A if anyone's interested, but really doesn't want to legalize slums and give people recognition and give people in the slum services. So they put up many roadblocks along the way, but we were able to take advantage of this to sort of put pressure on the state to provide citizens with water. So just a little bit more in pictures. So even though we're working in these marginalized slums, there's quite a lot of variation in terms of what they actually look like. So some are relatively sturdy, some are really fragile. It's just essentially a steel frame with a tarp over it. Each dwelling is basically like that. I already talked about other ways of accessing water. And, again, our preliminary field work showed that was really an impact of not having a municipal water connection. Most people we talked to were really kind of interested in getting a connection. The only time they weren't is if they were scared of the water mafia. And there was a gendered burden, or there is a gendered burden where when water is difficult to access, when people are waiting in long lines for the tanker or for a community pipe, it's often women and children who are doing that, and so there's a real kind of inequality in terms of the burden that not having a municipal water connection poses. So we essentially select for our sample 76 slums throughout the city of Mumbai. So this is a map of Mumbai, and you see the little blue squares are the slums that we chose, and you see that they're really strewn all over the city. Some of these slums are really large. Some of them can be up to 40,000 people. And so we wanted to, and then some are quite small, so we wanted to kind of standardize our units that we're studying. So we divided up the bigger slums into clusters. So overall, we had 152 clusters, and then included in our study were 50 households randomly selected from each cluster. So we had a total of about 7,000 households included in the study. And because we want to rigorously assess the effectiveness of the intervention, similar to a clinical trial, for many of you might be familiar that this is a common approach used in development or in global development to assess the effectiveness of an intervention or interventions, is to use an RCT or randomized controlled trial. So that's what our study is. And so we have a group of, we randomly assign each cluster into one of 4 groups. So they could either get just the bureaucratic assistance intervention, which we call T1. They could get the political pressure intervention, which we call T2. They could get both, or they could get neither, right? So 4 groups, and these are just some details about, how we basically assigned these interventions, which I can talk about in Q&A if anyone's interested. So just a little bit of background to kind of help kind of make the results make sense a little bit. So, so these are basically the steps that each household needs to follow in order to get a municipal water connection. So first, they need to submit an application. And the way this is done in Mumbai is they're forming groups of around 5 households. And the connection is provided to kind of 1 connection per 5 households. And the application is quite convoluted. Actually, for much of the time that we were doing the study, the requirement was that the form had to be submitted online and also needed a lot of associated documentation for basically the people to show proof of residency, which, as you can imagine, in this context is pretty difficult. Once the application is submitted, if the municipal corporation deems everything to be appropriate and there's a lot of discretion there, then an official from the municipal corporation visits the site and kind of takes another look at the documentation, takes a look at the area to see if a water connection is feasible. And if they determine everything's in order, then they issue what's called a P form, which is basically an approval for a connection. And then subsequently, hopefully if everything goes okay, again, this is not a guarantee, but then, a bunch of agencies have to cooperate to get the necessary permissions and technical assessments for the pipe laying work to begin, and eventually people hopefully will get a municipal water connection. So this is a little bit more about our intervention. So our first intervention, T1, essentially involved helping people navigate the bureaucratic process that I just described to get a water connection. So NGO partners and their volunteers basically went and visited the households in our study. They first of all educated them about their eligibility for water. Many of them didn't know about the ruling. They helped them with the application process. As you can imagine, many people in this community didn't know how to fill out an online application. And so they helped them with that. They helped them get the necessary associated documents. They helped them get, kind of signatures that they needed from a licensed plumber, and help them submit the application. So that was essentially, helping them with these pretty big hurdles, especially for this population that is often migrant, that is often not literate, helping them with the process of getting a connection. Now, in our setting, the bureaucracy doesn't always work the way it should, and just because some rules exist on paper doesn't mean they're actually carried out. And in this setting, as in many other settings in developing countries, bureaucrats are captured by politicians, right? So bureaucrats are informally very heavily influenced by politicians and will often do what politicians say, because politicians usually either formally or informally have control over their careers. So we sort of hypothesized going in that this bureaucratic assistance may not be enough by itself, and that we would need something to put political pressure on officials, but also elected representatives, the elected local councillors who can basically influence the bureaucracy to do or not do what it's supposed to, okay? So that was essentially the basis of our second intervention, T2, where our NGO partners and their volunteers, first of all, went in to these slums and raised awareness about this issue of water, educated them about their eligibility, but then also organized, first of all, letter writing campaigns, so petitions signed by all the residents, sent to various government officials and elected representatives, articulating and demanding water access, municipal water connection. They also organized delegations, as you can see in these pictures, groups of slum residents, and took them to visit the offices of local councillors, local state legislators, national legislators who were representing the area, to make a case and demand water. So that was the political pressure part of it. And, we saw from our data that I'm going to talk about that these interventions really worked. I mean, people really did go out and systematically apply this pressure on politicians. They felt more engaged, they were motivated, they were mobilized to participate in politics. So before we even get to the data, we got, or at least the efforts of our partners in connection with this project, got some local press. So you can see two incidents where these interventions really, in a sense, worked. So you can see this one place, after a 9-year struggle, they finally were able to get water. In this other place, RA, they were finally able to get the permissions necessary. It's called an NOC, petition, necessary to get a legal water connection. But of course, these are just kind of, anecdotal, and we wanted to more rigorously assess whether our interventions had an impact. So the way we did this was we conducted a survey. We did a baseline survey prior to the intervention with about 7,000 households. And a few months ago, we completed, actually not a few months ago, this was prior to COVID. So it's been so long since it started. We completed the first post-intervention survey round, where we recontacted, most of our sample was recontacted households, but of course in some cases we couldn't track them, and so we replaced them with new households in the same area and assessed outcomes. And this project is still ongoing because we are planning another survey, which was held up due to COVID, that we hope to do in a few months when things look a little bit better on the ground. And for this, we used a third-party survey company that had nothing to do with the NGOs, because we really wanted to make sure that the entities were separate. So What did we find, at least in our first kind of post-intervention survey? Well, first, encouragingly, we saw that our interventions did actually increase the applications that were submitted. So what this tells us is that there is a real kind of pent-up demand for municipal water, right? I mean, if people didn't want municipal water, they wouldn't have responded to the help that the NGO needed, because it involved a lot of cost and effort on their part as well. And so this was not only encouraging for us, but also evidence that there was this kind of pent-up demand for municipal water. We were also very encouraged because we did see that our interventions not only had an effect on citizens, but actually had an effect on bureaucrats. So if you compared the treatment groups to the control groups, and we asked them, did they receive a visit from an official who was part of the BMC water department to assess their eligibility for a water connection, and there was a significant difference between the treatment and control groups there, right? So not only did citizens kind of react, the bureaucrats reacted as well, so that was very encouraging. But overall, we did not see an overall effect in our overall sample on ultimately getting a connection. So that was, a little bit disappointing, but of course, we were very interested in why that might be the case, and if there was any variation within the sample in terms of who did and did not get water connections. And so we went in with some pre-registered hypotheses that we then went on to test with our survey data. And one thing that we found was that one thing that really made a difference in terms of whether households ultimately got a water connection or not as a result of our intervention was identity politics. So just to give you a very brief background, in Mumbai, identity politics plays a very big role. There's a real kind of anti-migrant sentiment that is whipped up by some of the influential political parties in the state, who are really who really advocate that Mumbai should be sort of returned to its original inhabitants, who are Marathi people, who are residents of the state of Maharashtra, and that the city should get rid of its migrants. Migrants are the ones who are responsible for all the city's problems. And so every election, politicians, from some of these parties really stir up this sentiment and are really kind of anti-migrant, and often as a result, anti-slum, because many of the slums are, composed very heavily of migrants. So we wanted to look at how the politician, the local councillor, whether if the local councillor belonged to the Marathi group, and if households were Marathi, if that would affect whether they got a water connection as a result of their intervention. And we found that this actually played a very important role, and that T2 in particular did result in people getting a water connection, but only if the representative was not Marathi. So, and also, we found that if the household was Marathi, this actually lowered the effectiveness of the intervention in terms of people actually being able to get a water connection. So this really, again, not only is encouraging that our our interventions did work in some subsection of the population, but also shed very interesting light in terms of when this bottom-up kind of intervention approach, which is often advocated by many NGOs and kind of, civil society groups as a way to kind of make change, when such interventions are able to work and when they are not able to work, unfortunately. And it's encouraging that this intervention actually worked in marginalized groups, where people are really, sort of more in need and more marginalized by the political process. So it really kind of is in a way encouraging that this intervention had an effect on this group, although obviously we were hoping that it would have an effect overall. So just to kind of say a little bit before I end, so, one thing that we really want to do in this project is we want to not only look at formalization, but we think that especially with water access, that this could really kind of have a far-reaching impact and touch a lot of these sustainable development goals. I mean, I'm sure all of you are familiar with them and sort of know that, and this is a big conversation on campus as well, and we really think that, you know, there's a lot to be done in our next survey in terms of assessing all of these outcomes, not to mention the fact that we have some really interesting data prior to COVID, right? And for some of you might know who have been following the media, there's been some media attention to India and the fact that, you know, COVID rates in India have been really high, but death rates have been really low, particularly in slum areas. And so we have a really interesting opportunity to look at that, given that we have this data from prior to COVID. And so we're hoping to do that in our next phase. So just a little kind of mention too here. So this was mostly a sort of a non-technical project. But one thing that we were interested in, and we will be interested in once we do our kind of final survey, is looking at whether indeed this water from a municipal water connection will result in better quality drinking water. And here we did make use of Oasis. I don't know if any of you are familiar, but that was developed by a Georgia Tech student. So or a company run by a Georgia Tech student. So that was a little mention there. And so I know we're going to be talking about, you know, the ways in which you all can play a role, and that will be that I just wanted to mention that here. So I think I'm not going to talk too much about my other projects, but I've done some other work on rural roads in India. So if anyone has any questions on that, I'm happy to answer them. I did some field work on that as well. And I have an ongoing project looking at gender and political representation of women in Bihar in India. And that is not really directly about infrastructure provision, but it looks at, you know, the role of women and how people respond to women offering development and infrastructure versus security and protection, and how people respond to that. So I want to stop here. Actually, before I do, I want to just give a brief plug to some of the programs that INTA has to offer in global development, in case you all aren't familiar. We would love to have you all in our courses and programs. We have a global development minor, which is joint with mechanical engineering, and I teach, I'm one of the faculty that teach the introductory course into 2050 for this minor, and my other colleagues who teach it are excellent as well. We also have a newly established graduate certificate in global development, and that's open to people who are enrolled in a graduate degree at Georgia Tech, or if you complete an undergraduate degree and you just want to stay on and get some coursework in development, that's an option. And then we also have in the works a one-year master's degree in global development, and those two things, the certificate and the master's degree, are joint with international affairs, economics, and city planning. So it's a really nice kind of range of disciplines that will give, we think, a really nice multidisciplinary perspective into global development. So I just want to mention that before I stop and open for questions, but I'm really looking forward to your thoughts and questions and feedback on this project. As I said, it's still ongoing, so I'm really excited to hear what you all have to say. So I will stop sharing my screen. My cursor won't stop jumping around. Not sure why it's doing that. Okay. Let's see, and show. Okay, maybe that will work. Not sure. Anya, is there a way for you to stop me? Oh, there we go. I think I can stop. Okay, I did.
Cool.
All right.
Awesome. And I'll be monitoring the chat if anyone has some questions. If not, I can kick it off too. I'll go first. I was wondering, I know that you had mentioned this and you said that you'd be willing to talk about it in the Q&A about like why governments don't want to legalize the slums. And then I also had like some more questions about like how you like selected the slums for your specific study, and like what factors were important for you guys.
Yeah, so great question. So the question of why they don't want to legalize slums is really interesting. So first of all, in part it has to do with sort of how valuable land and real estate is in the city. And Mumbai, it has one of the highest real estate costs, I think, in the world. And so the land that the slums are on, they're often on really prime property. And so state officials think they're losing out a lot of revenue by having these slums there, right? There's also a lot of kind of, sort of stereotypes and preconceived notions. One time I presented this to a non-academic audience, and someone actually stood up and yelled at me because I was, helping to bring, really establish slums more firmly in the city, and that was, this really kind of blight on the city's reputation. So those are a lot of the reasons. I mean, the state officials would get a lot of kickbacks and potential revenue if they were able to redevelop the land, for example. So they really don't want to do that. And then a big part of it is political. And the fact that there are these nativist parties who are really sort of anti-migrant and really kind of opposed to these slums because they're essentially a way to, keep migrants in the city and potentially attract more migrants, which they think is a really bad thing. So that's kind of the answer to that. And then in terms of how we chose the slums, it actually took a lot of intensive field work to identify these slums in our sample. And so our selection was definitely not random, and we were particularly choosing slums that did not already have where most of the residents did not have an existing municipal water connection, and also where there was a reasonable amount of interest. So we did kind of a pre-survey where there was like a reasonable amount of interest in getting municipal water connections. So we actually had to exclude places where the water mafia was really kind of active because people were too scared to even talk to us for those type of places. So we basically, where there was an interest, where people didn't already have, most people did not already have a municipal water connection, and where the slum was situated on land that wouldn't have made it too difficult to actually do the construction to establish it. So for example, if it was on a hill, then that we would exclude that because we knew that that would be really difficult. So.
Awesome, thank you. Gavin has a question from the chat. It says, what has been the overall most challenging process of this project as a whole, and were there times where the project looked like it was at a dead end?
Yeah, great questions. So there were a lot of challenges, through the entire process. So the first one was, in terms of convincing our local partners to do this study. So the grant that we got was really one of the requirements was that we do an RCT approach, that we do a randomized controlled trial approach. But our partners in the field, actually one of the organizations is called Pani Hat Samiti. It's a, kind of a water rights advocacy organization. And their slogan is water for all, right? So they said, we are about water for all. How can we deny water to a control group, because that was one of our kind of requirements for the study. And so, from our perspective, we were sort of arguing, well, if it wasn't for this funding, none of these places would be able to be helped because we were essentially helping them scale up their operations. And so, this is just sort of randomly deciding who gets to get this help first, right? And we're obviously not precluding them from helping the other places once the study ends. So that was challenging. There were a lot of challenges in terms of implementing the intervention. We've had, probably don't have time, but I have some interesting stories of what people faced in the field because there was a lot of opposition, especially from these Marathi politicians and people from these nativist parties to what we were doing. And so they tried to block the project in many ways. And yeah, I think those were the two biggest sort of challenges, and it took way longer than we anticipated. So that's always the case with this kind of situation. And yeah, I mean, so the dead end, right at the outset, it seemed like it was a dead end. And then, in terms of, we were being blocked by many places, but we were, I mean, actually all the credit goes to our partners who were successful in carrying out the intervention in almost all of the places that we had intended for the study.
Awesome. I had a question going off of that too. If anyone else has a question, feel free to interrupt me because I don't want to take up too much. But I was wondering when you talked about like your partners, did you guys have to do any like remote kind of like surveying and stuff with COVID-19 or like was this mainly completed beforehand?
I
Or
was
how was like your
I was also interested in hearing about how y'all shifted your focus with COVID. Like, how long did it take for y'all to readjust? I guess is my part of that question.
Yeah,
So,
so actually this round, I'm pretty sure, I'm not sure if I'm totally messing this up, but I'm pretty sure that our post-intervention round was all prior to COVID. So, so that was great there. And then we had actually intended to do our third round a few months ago. And then obviously that didn't happen. And so we've postponed that. But we haven't had to do any remote surveying, although we are thinking about it a lot right now, because as I mentioned, one of the things we're hoping to study is sort of the patterns of migration from, and back to these slums that was a result of COVID. And, even if so we don't want to do anything completely remote, but even if our survey team is able to go in the field, a lot of people probably are not going to return, and we don't want to over-select, the people that who are there. And so we are talking about doing a telephone survey and, all the challenges that go with that. But we haven't done anything. We haven't had to deal with COVID for this project so far. So, yeah.
That's really lucky. I'm just gonna interrupt really quickly too and say I know it's 8 o'clock in Wish for Wash. You guys have a meeting, so I just put the attendance form in the chat. But anyone else, like I know Gavin just put a question in the chat, and I honestly have a lot more questions. So Dr. Thomas, if you have time to stay after, I'm sure a lot of our members would be interested in still hearing you talk. But if you have another meeting, or if you're in Wish for Wash and you guys have your chapter meeting, feel free to fill out the attendance form and sign off when you need to. But Gavin asked another question in the chat. He asked if there were any instances of sabotage.
Sabotage, yeah. Yeah, so I mean, it was pretty much what, I had mentioned. So we had this, actually a couple of instances where when the intervention was happening and they saw that people were filling out these forms, this politician apparently sent his people to try to stop, stop our NGO people. And there's always a suspicion when you're doing anything like that you're working for a particular political party. So they were really kind of concerned that that was the case. So there were a couple of cases definitely of that during the intervention phase. And then during the survey phase, it was taking place close to an election. So it was, I think, close to the state election, if I'm not mistaken. And so, again, they thought that the enumerator, he didn't have his badge that day, so they thought that he was working for a political party, and they kidnapped him. And so so there were a lot of instances, but luckily we were able to kind of circumvent it in most cases, except there were some slums where they just couldn't do any work because there was too much opposition and people just wouldn't even talk to our partners. So yeah.
Jake had a question too. He asked, are infrastructure projects politicized in Mumbai like they are often here in the US?
Absolutely. So, yeah. So, I mean, I guess there's a lot of dimensions to this question. I mean, this is actually exactly where my research is, and even the research that I alluded to on roads was exactly about kind of politicization. And so, absolutely. So, it's politicized in a number of ways. I mean, one, as I mentioned, the bureaucracy is often sort of politically captured. And so in order to actually, get things done, politicians often have to exert influence. And oftentimes, as in the case that I just talked about, they're exerting influence to make sure things are not done. Right. And so it's politicized in that way. It's politicized in the way that certain parties will claim credit. One interesting thing that happened is there was this one local politician who was really kind of opposed to the work that our partners were doing in terms of helping people get a water connection. And then they actually got a water connection. And then the next thing we knew, there was that big billboard that the politician put up saying, I have provided water to this slum and please vote for me. And so, they were really opposed, but then, they didn't hesitate to kind of take credit for that. So yeah, it's politicized in a number of ways, and in India too, more generally, it's also the case.
Hey, I had a quick question. When you're talking about adding water connections, does that actually run into people's individual houses, or is that like a public thing, or how exactly does that work?
Yeah, good question. So in this case, the connection is given to a group of households. So it's like 5 households come together and fill out an application, and it'll still typically be a stand post. I mean, these dwellings are so close together, so it'll typically be a stand post that serves kind of 5 households, basically. Yeah. But I mean, when they don't have a municipal water connection, one of the ways that they are accessing water is through more of a community pipe that there's, like one per maybe 200 households, and then they're lining up and, all of that stuff. But this is to provide more sort of household level access, but it's still not one per household. That's not the way they do it. I mean, they do it for non-slum dwellings, one per household, but for slum dwellings, the policy is that it's groups of households.
Thank
I have a
you.
question. Were there some people part of your project who maybe had a more difficult time assimilating to Indian culture? You know, I understand you yourself are Indian, but were there others who maybe going over to India maybe had a culture shock or had some sort of delay in understanding the culture?
Yeah, that's interesting. So actually I should have mentioned. So this project was in collaboration with 2 other professors. One is at Columbia and one is at University of California, San Diego, and they both are specialists in India. So one of them is from India and one of them is British, but has spent years in India. So not for our research team. And then we were working with the rest of our team was all local people. So, but that said, so I grew up in Mumbai, but, I had never actually spent a lot of time in, these types of settings. And so still for me, it was a lot of learning. I think just because you're from a place, right? I mean, we all know this, right? That, that particular setting was still new to me. And, even as far as slums go, there's so much variation. I mean, there's really, everyone knows about, kind of the more famous ones, but there's really so much variation. And so there's always, I think, a learning curve and a cultural sort of barrier. And a lot of these people who are living there are from different cultures within India. So there's always a learning experience and cultural barriers. So that's an interesting question.
Kind of on that, and someone please interrupt me if you have a question. I know I keep asking too many. I was gonna ask, I felt like it kind of piggybacked off of like you saying that you grew up in Mumbai, like how you got involved in this project. And like I know that you said you had multiple different projects like in India, but I was wondering like how you found the projects and how that kind of worked.
Yeah, great question. So with this particular project, it was interesting. I had read a few anthropologist works on Mumbai. So my interest has always been in development and in public service provision. And somewhere in my graduate school career, I decided that India was probably a good place to do that. I was always motivated by the kind of issues I saw growing up. And then this particular project, I was reading some work of anthropologists who were sort of looking at this issue of water in Mumbai. And then I saw this call for this grant, and the grant was on formalization. It was just formalization more broadly. And typically, you think of formalization when it comes to sort of business or land or things like that. But the anthropological work that I had read, which is really fascinating, and I'm happy to provide references if anyone's interested, really kind of made me think of this water issue as an issue of formalization. And so we applied for the grant, and we obviously couldn't have done it without the funding, but so it was kind of a fortuitous meeting of kind of the grant and then, the situation. And then we were able to have contacts with the partners. We knew them, I had come across someone who was working in this sort of grassroots advocacy space. And so it kind of flowed organically from there.
I had another question. So again, someone just interrupted me, but I was gonna ask about, so one thing that I think like relates a lot to our teams when we're working on like international projects is working with NGOs in country. And I know specifically for my project, I know you saw the chapter updates, but I was like PLing for a project where we didn't have like an NGO in country, and like we had a lot of issues finding in-country contacts that were like reliable. And I was wondering if you guys had any similar issues and how you kind of went about that, and like what you thought were like maybe like indicators of like a reliable source or reliable partner that like you were able to find.
Yeah, that is a great question. So, yeah, I mean, so we, as I mentioned, so we had, when we decided we wanted to focus on water and do this project, I had met someone at a conference who sort of worked on kind of service provision in slums, or was part of an organization. And so it was through kind of a contact that we got connected with one of the organizations. And then they have a pretty reputable presence. So I think that was part of that they had a national presence, like they have a website. And initially the sort of, they're not the head of the organization, but whoever the managers, were quite kind of hesitant about our project, but they were always very professional. And that was really kind of important to us that, they were just kind of regular, punctual, timely, even in our initial interactions, and that was important. And then the other organization we worked with was more of an advocacy grassroots organization, and its leader was, that organization's leader was more of this like charismatic, rabble-rousing type of person who was, less frankly responsible and easy to work with, but we really needed his kind of, personality and skills to do this kind of grassroots advocacy stuff that we were doing. So that part was definitely challenging, but it helped actually to work with two organizations and they were partnering. So we could kind of use, that relationship a little bit better. And, we had, an easier time kind of navigating it because we were able to work with both of them. So yeah, but that's a good question. I mean, it's always kind of, I think, a little bit of an unknown territory when you start and you have to kind of figure it out along the way. But I think just having those local contacts has been valuable, because without that, it's really difficult to understand the context. I mean, they played a really important role in helping us design the project even. I mean, otherwise we'd just be going in blind. And so that was really important to us.
I think that's something too that relates. All of our projects currently have like NGO partners in country if they're international. But the project that I was on that just closed out, when it was started, it was like submitted by an individual. So that was something that like we had a lot of issues with, was like maintaining and like having a reliable community contact, and then a reliable community contact that was actually representative of like community needs instead of just their specific wants. And so I think that's something that our chapter as a whole is kind of trying to reflect on to make sure that like we're not making the same mistakes that we made the first time. So I think that's really interesting and helpful. And we might be reaching back out to you too as like we're continuing these projects, if that's okay.
Of course. Yeah.
Okay, I have like so many questions. I feel so bad, so please interrupt me. I was gonna ask too about, I know you mentioned that you guys were kind of like looking at making another phase of your project. I was wondering, like, are you gonna be able to use those community contacts to like do like possibly remote if you still can't travel there? And then I also just wanted to learn more about what the next phase was gonna look like.
Yeah. So, so when you say community contacts, the NGO partners, you mean, or yeah. So, I mean, we don't plan to do another big intervention. I mean, this was such a big, expensive study. I mean, I think, going to wait and take a breather before we do anything really big like that. And so what we wanted to do was more sort of follow up, kind of survey work. Given that one, we do have these interventions that were conducted and a lot of things could change. So even though now we, for example, find no effect in the overall sample for the water connections. It's possible that in a year we could. It's possible that these interventions had other effects that we want to look at. And then, like I said, there's the COVID thing. So what we're interested in doing is doing a follow-up survey with these hopefully same households, or at least households in the same area. And we do plan to work with the same survey firms. So that was the other thing, is we have this other dimension of local stuff going on, which was more of the knowledge gathering in the form of the survey. And so and again, they're a very reputable organization that's worked with a lot of academics and things like that. So we're definitely hoping to re-engage with them. And like the remote thing, I think we're considering the telephone calls, and just to get into the weeds. One thing that, we're wondering is, are people over the phone going to really want to talk to us, answer some random survey? So we're thinking of giving them incentives, like paying them, but sometimes that raises like kind of cultural issues. And then also, how do you give people payment? I mean, there's all these, Paytm and all these things, but, they come with their own issues, and, they're sometimes not actually valuable to people. Because you can give cell phone credits, but sometimes they're not valuable to people. So those are, kind of some considerations. So, but we don't want to do a fully remote survey. We'd rather wait because we just don't think that the data quality is going to be as good. So, yeah.
I also someone please cut me off if you have to. I was wondering, like, this isn't like a really big question or anything, like how much time like you actually had to spend like in the field for this?
Yeah, so yeah, good question. I mean, so it was at many phases through the entire project. So I never spent a big chunk of time all at once, but I would say, I don't know, in total, and there were three of us, so we were sort of tag teaming for different phases of the project too. So, and there were definitely times where we were none of us were there. And actually that's the other thing I forgot to mention in terms of a local contact. We have this really awesome local research assistant he was a university student in Mumbai, and he's just amazing, and we couldn't have done any of this without him. And so he was kind of our local presence, throughout the project. But I spent a total of maybe 2 months, I want to say, but it was spread over, kind of a long period. Yeah.
I think I'll open if anyone else has any questions. Or else I don't want to take up too much of your time too. And I just want to say again, like, we really appreciate you coming out. This was such a great talk. I know a lot of people are in the chat saying that this was so insightful. And I've gotten a lot of messages too. So I just wanted to say thank you again from like me and all of our members.
Yeah, thank you really for having me. And if anyone has any questions, wants to send me an email later, or I'm happy to talk further. And really, yeah, it was really fun to have this chance to talk to you guys.
Awesome. Does anyone else have any final questions? Looks like we're good. I think people keep signing off, but I can leave it open if anyone thinks of anything, or Dr. Thomas, if you have any last things that you want to say, or Shobhan before we end.
Thank you so much. That's all. Not a question, just thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for doing this.
Sure, my pleasure.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Thomas. This is Tyler. I was just
Yes.
wanted to say briefly, it was because I took your class last year, and it was
Yes,
interesting to
I
hear like the
remember.
updates,
I know, it's nice to see you, or
the
hear
updates
you.
from the
Yeah.
project. Yeah, Anya invited me, and I was like, oh yeah, like I love Dr. Thomas. So I was it was really cool to hear the like continuation and just like the new
Yeah.
updates from everything. So
Yeah, you heard the early version of it, I remember. So yeah, great to have you here, Tyler.
yeah.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. I really appreciate your time, and keep in touch. I'm really happy to answer any questions going forward. So
Yeah,
thanks a lot,
awesome. Thank
Anya.
you for your
Really
time.
appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Bye.